We are in Genesis chapter 12. You want to turn over there. We made it kind of midway through chapter 12 last week. Of course, we're continuing our study of the life of Abraham. Not just trying to, understand the things of his life and the things he did, but to understand why he's referenced so much in the New Testament and to help us understand those references so that when Jesus or someone else references Abraham in a specific situation or something overall about him, understanding his life will make those things a lot clearer and more understandable for us. So we went through, like I said just a moment ago, midway through Genesis chapter 12. In this chapter we see that Abram, he's called Abram still at this time, he hasn't got the name Abraham yet. Abram has been called from the land of Haran, where his father Terah had gotten as far as that point, did not go all the way to Canaan, but he is called to go down to Canaan, and he does. He takes with him all of his possessions. This includes the servants, slaves that he has in his service, his wife Sarai, who is not yet called Sarah, and his nephew Lot. Lot is with him for a good portion of his lifetime. So Abram has gone down, and we have a little map here. So he's started out in chapter 11 he was in Ur, and then his father Terah takes his household up to Haran, and now he's gone down to the land of Canaan. We know he goes to Shechem. It talks about there's this great tree there of, let's see, I'm missing the spot here. The great tree of Morah, or the terebinth tree, I think some other translations will use that term. I kind of pointed out last week that we get great trees mentioned in this area up until the time of Judges. When we get to Gideon, when it talks about that area, the great trees aren't mentioned anymore. It talks about the hills and the hill country. It doesn't mention any trees, which kind of leads me to think that probably those trees weren't around anymore. Probably been used up and deforested. I didn't mention this last week, but I think there's another example that goes concurrently with this. Some of you may recall when David is preparing for the groundwork of the temple to be laid. Of course, he didn't build it; Solomon built it. But they had to get their timber and their lumber up from the king of Tyre, up farther north, and that would be kind of the area where Lebanon is. Of course, there's this kind of almost mythical thing about the great cedars of Lebanon. Those don't exist anymore either. They're not there anymore either. You can go to Lebanon. Lebanon even has a picture of the cedar on their flag, I believe. But they're not there. Like, there's no great forest of Lebanon anymore. Those are all gone. Which kind of, when you read through the story of people way, way back in Abraham's time, they were probably going through a land that looked quite a bit different than it does now. Because we can look at pictures of, this is the modern day area of Israel and Palestine, and, it doesn't look all that great sometimes, does in certain areas, but it probably was a lot more lush of an area way back when. Just kind of, we see these mentions of these great forests or these great trees, but they're just not around anymore. So just an interesting thing, not really important to the story, just, maybe something for your general understanding of, kind of our human history here. So Abram he goes all the way through, talks about how he goes through Bethel and Ai, places that would be mentioned later on. In fact, Bethel is not even the name of that place yet. It's called Zoar, I think, at this time. It doesn't get that name until later on. In Genesis, I'm going to have to look at my notes because I don't have that off the top of my head. That'd be in Genesis 28:19 when Jacob gives it that name. Or I'm sorry, not Zoar. It's called Luz at this time. I'm thinking of a different place. It's called Luz during the time that Abram would be going through there. And of course, we know Ai is mentioned later after the fall of Jericho when the Israelites are going through and taking the land. And then at the end of where we read verse 9 of chapter 12, we see that Abram had gone through the entire area, and now he's in the Negev, which is this area kind of south of Beersheba. It's kind of a wilderness, desert-ish kind of area. No one really lives there. You have some nomads, but where there's not water, you're not going to have great civilizations. So it's kind of a wilderness area. He's passed through all the way through all of Canaan land at that point. And that's where we stopped last week. Any comments, further thoughts, or anything before we move on to verse 10? Okay. We're going to get into I guess it's a kind of next step in his journeys here in the second half of the chapter. Someone read for us just verse 10. We're just going to talk about verse 10. Someone read verse 10 for us, please.
Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land.
Okay, so I'm going to spend way too much time talking about one verse. I'm going to make you guys learn something as best I can. So remember, as I said just a moment ago, at the conclusion of verse 9, he's in the area of the Negev, this area south of kind of this orangish color. So he's there, and we're told that there is a famine going on, so he chooses to go to Egypt. Now, why would Abram choose to go to Egypt? What would be the rationale behind that?
Food.
You want food. Why do we go to Egypt for our food? Okay, yeah, I heard several people say it. So, the Negev, it's already this desert area. There's not a lot of sources of water, so if you don't get any rainfall, you can't just go to a spring or something like that readily available. But Egypt, on the other hand, has a very major water source, the Nile River. It cannot be understated how important the Nile River is to Egypt. Even when you don't get rainfall, as long as the river is pumping water downstream, you can irrigate your crops. So you can, even when there's not a lot of rainfall in the area, as long as the water comes down the river, hey, I've got water, I can irrigate crops. We can still grow when there's famine. So basically, this leads to Egypt being a superpower in the ancient world. Without the Nile River, that would not be the case. The Nile River is the lifeblood of Egypt, and basically becomes the breadbasket of the world. Even up to the point of the Roman Empire, Egypt is exporting grains and food and all this stuff. It was a great exporter of agriculture. In fact, if I was looking this up because, of course, I couldn't help myself. A recent article from USAID, that today's country, according to them, today's country of Egypt still has a very major agricultural sector, which contributes 11.3% of its total GDP. So a whole tenth of the nation is dependent on agriculture. 28% of all jobs in Egypt are agricultural related, and more specifically, 55% of all jobs in the Upper Nile region are agriculture related. So it's still a very big, important part of Egypt's economy, its culture. This is why if you pay attention to news of that region, there's a lot of pushback from Egypt allowing nations farther up the Nile building dams because they're afraid they're going to get their water source cut off, or it's going to be affected in some way that will not benefit them because they got to have the Nile. They're so dependent on that river. We're going to get a similar instance of this later in the Bible. That kind of begins in Genesis 41, where there's a great famine in the land and a bunch of people, it talks about the whole world comes to Egypt to get food. Now, in that case, you have the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. So it seems like that was a much more serious, much longer famine. And it's through the work of Joseph that Egypt is able to meet that demand. And this isn't in my notes, but I was thinking about it. If you think in terms of economics, when the whole world comes to you for the one product that they need and you alone have, you're going to get extremely wealthy. In fact, in the little time after Genesis 41, it talks about Pharaoh being enriched by people coming to purchase food because they couldn't get anywhere else. And I was thinking about how much of that, how much of those riches and stuff were taken by the Israelites when they left in the Exodus. It just kind of makes me think of things like that. You can't really trace all of that stuff, but it's interesting to see that there's this huge accumulation of wealth in Egypt, and then the Israelites take a lot of that wealth with them when they leave in Exodus. So not really concerned with Abraham's life, just kind of a side note I think is really interesting. And one other thing is, if you think about why would Abram go to Egypt, it's not really that far. He's in this area. He's just got to get across the Sinai Peninsula. I'm not exactly sure where in the Negev he is, but it's not that far. It's not like he's up in Haran or the northern part of Canaan. He's actually not that far from Egypt. So it kind of makes sense that this is where he goes. So people, when they say, well, why would he go to Egypt to escape a famine? Well, that's the most logical place to go. especially in his situation. So I don't think there's an issue with him doing that. The issues are going to come later on. We'll read about it in a second. Any comments, anything on verse 10? I probably went way too detailed on that, but I think some of this background helps us to understand some of the decisions people make sometimes. Okay, let's get someone to read for us then, verses 11 through 13, please.
And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, "Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen, when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, and they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you."
Okay. There's absolutely no problem with this plan, right? Let's get into it a little bit. So as they're about to enter Egypt, Abram tells his wife Sarai to basically claim that they're siblings instead of spouses. Just say that you're my sister. And he gives two reasons. One is so that he's going to benefit or be treated well on her because of her. The fact that she's got, if he's got this sister, somebody might treat them well. He's like, well, this, the sister is very beautiful. Let me treat you, and maybe you'll have something that you can do in return for me. But the second reason is so that he's not killed, in case some other man sees how beautiful she is and wants to take her for himself. Now, I want to make a few notes about this plan, just to maybe give us a little bit more background, or maybe it might even make us more confused. I'm not sure. In Genesis, going back to Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, it tells us that Abram was 75 years old when he leaves Haran to go down to Canaan. All right. Now, we know from Genesis 17, verse 17, that Sarai is 10 years younger than Abram. So this would make Sarai at least 65 years old when this is taking place. So husbands, it might be really charming to tell your 65-year-old wife that she's so beautiful that someone might kill you because she's so beautiful, so they can take her as a wife. Yeah, maybe that's cute, but this is not a good plan. This has other conflicts that are about to come up as we'll read. And it really, in a way, kind of makes us question why Abram was doing this. He's afraid of being killed. That seems to be the main reason. But shouldn't God be protecting him in these situations? Like, what is he afraid of? God gave him promises earlier in this chapter that he would become a great nation. He hasn't had any kids yet. Why does he think God is going to allow, some terrible fate to befall him? I don't know. We're not given a lot of information about this instance. Of course, we're going to have this kind of come up later again in Genesis 20. Now, in Genesis 20, specifically verse 12, Abraham explains that Sarah is, in fact, his sister. They're half-siblings. So he kind of says, well, I'm not really lying because she really is my sister. But this is obviously misleading. Let's not, try to dust it under the rug. This is misleading at best. They are spouses, but they're not claiming that. So that's the plan they have going forward here. And then we're going to see how it works out starting verse 14. Any comments up to verse 13? Go ahead, Jeff.
Several things. It seems to me that in a strange way, several things are possibilities. It seems that there is a little bit of the fact that women are not, Sarah's wishes are not considered here. So all they have to do to have Sarah as a wife is to kill Abraham. Sarah really doesn't have anything to do with it. So that's something that is a possibility. To be fair, there are places on the earth right now where people treat children and women as property anyway. So it's not like it's only used to be and we're so enlightened now. Also, make me realize that while Abraham had great faith, Abraham didn't know God the way we can know God. He didn't have a written law. How many times do you think God had spoken to Abraham in his life?
We know of at least one instance. So.
Well, maybe
that we have recorded.
Maybe
anyway.
a few dozen times. Maybe. But we read the Bible every day of our life. So, it's not that what he's doing is not wrong. I think what he's doing is terribly misguided, and he'll reap pretty much what he sows here, and cause a lot of trouble. It's not all to other people, but some trouble to himself, it's kind of believe. But in any case, Abraham is a person who maybe he's kind of struggling the way we are. While we've got God's will, we can read it every day, we don't understand it all. Mm-hmm. So, in any case, I sometimes think this is an easy thing to pick on, and it is not incorrect to say that Abraham did wrong. But I think if we understand the difference in time, we'll realize why God didn't strike him dead, or God didn't speak of this in a way to denote his unfaithfulness in some way. There are a lot of things in ancient times God, because they didn't have the knowledge that we have today, God kind of looked the other way, literally, and that's what Acts 17 indicates.
And we can also say that probably over the course of time, even though Abram's 75 years old at least already, he's still got a lot of growing to do. And we're going to see that, well, we're going to see a lot of that. He's going to have more missteps. I mean, I already mentioned Genesis 20, where they're going to do kind of the exact same thing here again for some reason. But he's going to have other missteps too, and he's going to have to learn from those things, and he's going to have to go past those things. So there's going to be more for him to learn. So, I mean, I guess we could say he leads probably an exceedingly long life, but not that much longer than a lot of people live today. I would say that even those who are of older age still have something to learn. I don't think that's controversial to say, but there are some people who say, well, I'm such and such an age, there's nothing left for me to learn. I'm just going to go by what I know and not worry about anything else. I think there's always more room for us to grow, no matter what our situation is or what we think our situation is. There's always room for improvement. Just Abraham makes it easier for us to recognize. I saw a hand up here. Yes, go ahead.
Not in dispute or anything of that nature, but I don't think that Abraham is ever called wrong in these scriptures. And you got to understand that he wasn't promised at this point that Sarah would be the one that was going to bear the child.
Well, but if he's dead, he's not going to be able to have a nation. So it would stand to reason that he.
I understand that, but if I give it to Sarah, I'm still able to continue the mission that God has set up for me. You also got to understand that there are customs like Jeff was talking about over there in this particular region of the world. He understood the customs. And we can sit here from an American standpoint, U.S. standpoint, and we make judgments of what Abraham was and what Abraham wasn't. And we pass judgments and say he was wrong in this or he was wrong in that. The Bible doesn't call him wrong, just like it doesn't call Noah wrong for being drunk when his son saw him naked. So we pass those kinds of judgments in our minds. And I think we need to be very careful when we start passing judgments on these individuals, because we wasn't in their situation. We didn't have to live the life that they were living. And we have to trust that the Bible tells us what it tells us and take the Bible for what it says.
Yeah, Genesis certainly doesn't. Genesis a lot of times speaks in a very factual, non-biased way. It just says so-and-so did this, so-and-so did that. But we see, several places where somebody is clearly wrong. I mean, I'm not talking about this specifically. Like the issue with Judah and Tamar, I would say that Judah was probably in the wrong on that whole situation. But it doesn't say that. It just kind of leads us to that conclusion because of what we learn later on about what God wants his people to do. So I can't be too harsh on Abraham. Yeah, I wasn't there. I don't know what was going on. But it certainly seems that this is probably not the wisest thing to do. I don't think that's too controversial to say. But we're going to see how it works out. I think we're going to talk more about some of those things. But maybe we can get a better idea of it if we discuss it further. Let's finish this section. Someone read for us verses 14 through 20, and then we'll talk about how this works out.
So it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great
Okay, so a lot of interesting stuff going on here. So they get to Egypt, and Abram is not exactly wrong in what he was stating before in his plan. Because guess what? They do find Sarai to be a very beautiful woman. Like, I kind of joke, like, she's 65, what would they? But apparently she is very beautiful. So I don't know what the standards were at the time. It seems very interesting to me. But they do find her beautiful, so much so that they're kind of bragging about it to Pharaoh. Pharaoh hears about this, and he's so, I don't know, enthralled with the stories. He has her brought to him, brings her into his palace. And Abram's right again, because he is treated really well while he's there. If you go to verse 16, talks about how they treat Abram well. And depending on your translation, words that most of them will kind of at least imply that the sheep, the cattle, the donkeys, the camels, the servants or slaves that he acquires is kind of gifted to him. That's kind of how I read that. Not all translations will word it that way, but that's kind of my understanding is Abram was gifted these things, you would say, kind of to give his blessing if they were, Pharaoh wanted to take her as his wife. Which would not be an uncommon thing to do. We see things like this in the Bible time and time again. So the weird thing about this is Abram is kind of right in his plan. He's not being killed, and he's being treated well, and those are the two reasons he gave of why he was going to do this. So in that regard, he's not wrong, because it's working out exactly as he kind of predicted. One thing I do want to mention, it's kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but I think for the sake of trying to understand how things fit into place here, I want to talk about Hagar for just a second. She's not mentioned by name until Genesis chapter 16, so we're not really talking about her yet. But it's quite possible that it's this time when she joins Abram's entourage, if she's one of the female slaves that's delivered to him during this time. Because we do know from Genesis 16 verse 1 that she is an Egyptian slave. They specifically calls her Egyptian. We're not sure exactly, but it would make sense that this is kind of the time when she joins Abraham's group. We don't know for sure. I just wanted to point out that that's probably a possibility there. Because after this, he's not going to be going back down there anytime soon. So just a thought. We don't really know for sure, but I think it's a strong possibility. So anyway, Pharaoh's taken Sarai into his house. Abram's being treated well. So things are going well for Abram, sort of, except looks like he's about to lose his wife here to Pharaoh, because it looks like Pharaoh wants to take her as his own. But God intercedes. So just want to make a point here that God is directly involved in this here. He intercedes. He inflicts some serious disease on Pharaoh's household. Some of your translations may vary on what that disease may be. But it seems to be because of what Pharaoh is intending to do. Now, we don't know exactly how, because again, Genesis doesn't always give us a lot of information about these things. But somehow Pharaoh, or at least someone in his palace, figures out that Sarai is Abram's wife, and the afflictions that they are receiving is a result of him trying to take Sarai for himself. Again, we don't know exactly how they come to that conclusion. I'm not sure it's like deductive reasoning or there was something else that was going on. Again, more details would be nice, but we don't get those. So Pharaoh is understandably kind of unhappy about this. He's been misled. I mean, again, if they're not exactly lying because they say, "Oh, we're half siblings." This is what Abraham says in chapter 20. We don't get that detail here. I'm sure that I wouldn't be surprised if that conversation included that. But they are half siblings. But obviously, he's been misled here. They are husband and wife, and basically, Pharaoh is mad. He's like, "Here, take your wife back. This is obviously your wife. Take her. Get out of here." And they do leave Egypt, and they seem to leave with all the stuff that they had, including probably what he was gifted. I'm going to assume that that's the case. Again, we're not given super details on that, but it seems he took everything he had coming in, plus the things he got while he was in Egypt. So I think it's interesting to kind of think about here, and I think we may have mentioned this in one of your classes recently. I brought this up. The Egyptians here are not mentioned as being a godly people or righteous people, but they still seem to understand and respect the union of marriage and the power of God, or at least the power of God in that regard. Because Pharaoh understands that a line has been crossed here. He was about to take someone else's wife, and he understands that that was probably the wrong move as far as, if he had known, he would not have done that. So it's interesting when we think about all the nations and the peoples that Abraham encounters. They're not called godly or righteous. In fact, some of them are called the opposite at times. But they still seem to understand at least some of what God expects of them. We don't know, because we're not told what things God has told them. Like we see later on characters like Melchizedek, who is clearly a very righteous and God-fearing man, but does that really include all the nations around them? We don't know. We're not given a lot of detail about that. But it seems that God had at least some kind of expectations for them, and they understood at least some of them. That's about as far as I can go with that. Arnold, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to mention that in those times, God, as He is now, is in control of everything. So Pharaoh is supposed to be the leader of that region. So he had people around him that he, I guess, expects advice from. So when you have something as drastic as a plague coming into your house, I'm pretty sure he asked everyone around you, what's happening?
Yeah.
What's going on? And in some way, I think they knew of Abraham and, that his beliefs and stuff. So it kind of traced it back to him. Okay, this is the problem.
Yeah, it could be just simple deductive reasoning at that point, yeah.
Yeah. God's still in control of it all.
Yeah, and and we'll talk about kind of a bit more about how God's influence really impacts the story. But one other thing, kind of a side note to think about, and again, I don't really know for sure, but it's an interesting thought to think about. When we get later on in Genesis, when Joseph's brothers come to buy food, when the famine of 7 years, when they come to buy food, and they're asked to stay and eat. It mentions that the Egyptians did not eat with the Hebrews. There was like a very clear division about that. I don't know if it stems from this instance in particular, because as far as I know, there's not a lot of contact between the descendants of Abraham and the Egyptians from this point until when Joseph's brothers come to Egypt. There doesn't seem to be a lot of contact there, at least not directly. So I don't know for sure, or if this was just a thing Egyptians did with all peoples. They did not eat with them. There was a clear kind of, I don't want to call it racial divide. I'm not sure that's the right term, but they did not have respect for Hebrews. Again, I don't know if this is the reason. If this is something that was recorded and they said, well, we're not going to trust Hebrews anymore because they tried to dupe our Pharaoh this one time. I don't know. Just an interesting thought. Because when we think, how these things in the Bible fit, this could be one of the reasons that they did not eat with them. I don't know for sure. It's a guess. We're not told. Just a thought. One other note I want to say about this, and then I'll take kind of final comments and questions. This is not and I'm going to kind of explain more about Abram's plan here. This is not a great plan, but they seem to end up just fine at the end of all of this. But this is really just because God intercedes. If you kind of think this through, kind of these what-if situations or alternate history situations, if God does not cause these afflictions to Pharaoh's household, Pharaoh probably would have gone ahead and made Sarai his wife. So if that happens, Abram no longer has a wife. We don't know what would really happen to him in that regard. If he protests, would he be killed? How would this play out? It doesn't seem like it would play out well if God had not interceded here. So it seems that Abram probably didn't have the best plan, but God works with it. God is going to say, I made you a promise. And he's going to make sure that Abram comes out just fine. In fact, it seems that he probably came out even more wealthy than when he came in, because he acquired all these gifts and things and seems to have left with them. And again, this situation is going to come up in Genesis chapter 20. It's going to have a very similar outcome. We're going to get a little bit more details about it when we get to that instance in Genesis 20. But it's just very interesting to see how God is going to take a situation and he's going to make it right when it is his will to do so. I don't think that should encourage us to kind of say, well, I can do whatever I want now because God's going to protect me no matter what. I think some people would kind of take that logic and go that route. I don't think that's the lesson here. I think the lesson is God is going to make sure that he fulfills his promises and he's going to protect those that are his. If we put ourselves outside of that, I don't think that we would be receive such intercession as Abram did in this situation. I think that's about all I have to say about that. Any further comments or anything on this? Go ahead, Jeff.
Say a little bit about honesty. We don't want to go down all of the avenues of what it means to tell the truth, but the Bible nowhere says that in order to be honest, you have to say everything you know. So we parse out knowledge on, number one, a need-to-know basis, and on number two, if we have some affinity with someone, we may give a greater context. The context means that we'll tell you information that is useful to you. We don't want to just tell you information that's not useful to you, even though it may be something I know about the person. So Abraham, technically did not tell a lie. She is his sister. But she did deceive him. That's true.
Yeah.
So what I always try to do, and I don't know if this works as well in everybody's mind, but I try to put myself in the other person's shoes, and what would he expect me to tell him if he knew everything I know? What would he expect me to tell him? And so I do my best to tell him the things, because honesty is a measure of a relationship. So I'm trying to act in accord with our relationship. We may be close, we may not be close. The closer I am to you, then the more I need to reveal to you, or the more you will expect me to give you context for what we're talking about. And you might feel deceived if I leave something out. It's a measure of our bond that I tell you the things that you would expect me to tell you. And I use some judgment about that. But when I've done that, I've told the truth. And if there's a misunderstanding beyond that, maybe I may reflect later, I probably should have told you more, I apologize. But we do the best we can. It's not that we're being dishonest. It's that telling the truth doesn't mean telling. Some people have that idea. You don't tell them everything you know about something. You haven't told the truth. But again, we have to use some judgment about that. We're trying to build a relationship and keep that relationship strong, and we're willing to say whatever is useful to you in order to keep that relationship strong.
I would say, kind of building on that, intention matters quite a bit here. What was Abraham's intention here? It was to not die and to be treated well. And I guess both of those things did happen. So you could say in one way his plan was a success, but really only because God intercedes here. And on the fact of intention, if you go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 4, when the serpent tells the woman, you'll surely not die when you eat this fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. He wasn't exactly wrong because she didn't drop dead right then, but it was really only part of the truth without the context necessary in that regard. His intent was to deceive the woman in that instance. I'm not sure if Abram intended to deceive the Egyptians to this extent that things were going to go down a bad road anyways. His intent was to not die and be treated well. I guess those are good intentions, but they seem to be kind of short-sighted. Again, what if God does not intervene here? He's going to lose Sarai anyways. This just doesn't seem like it was totally thought out. Again, it's hard to say. I wish there was more details about that. We'll talk about more of this when we get to Genesis chapter 20, because we're going to see the same kind of thing come up. But it's going to give us a little bit more detail and kind of how it plays out and what the conversation was from Abraham's side. He's going to have a little bit more to say in Genesis 20. But clearly the Egyptians are not happy. Pharaoh's not happy with being misled. That's the nice way to say it. Yeah.
And just one more thing, fear does come into play here. When you're at ease, we tend to be honest and trusting people generally. When we're in fear of our lives, then we're tempted, and sometimes the lines feel like they're a little more blurred. That doesn't justify lying or deceiving someone, but it is something to recognize here.
Yeah.
I think, I agree that you would think that Abraham later thought better of the matter, but then he did the same thing.
Right,
So-
right. And again, going kind of back to intent on that is we can tell the truth and still deceive somebody if we don't give the context or we don't give the full explanation. Or we see this again in when Satan is trying to tempt Jesus. Satan is quoting scriptures. Are we going to say that those scriptures are wrong, or that that God is lying in some way? No, but he was not giving a correct context to those. So we need to be. Sometimes we'll be so adamant that, hey, I'm telling the truth, I haven't lied, but we still may have intended to deceive in how we told it. So it's a gray area that we should probably try to avoid entirely as much as we can. How wrong was Abraham in this regard? I mean, he certainly seems to have feared for his life. Does that justify what he did? I don't know. It doesn't seem to be maybe the best idea, but that's the route he went anyways. Any other comments, questions on chapter 12 here? Okay, this is a good stopping point. I know we have a couple minutes, but I'm just going to wrap it up because I'm not going to get into chapter 13. We'll pick up chapter 13 next week. We're going to kind of get into the situation with Lot a bit more. Lot's kind of been in the background. We've seen him mentioned several times up to this point, but now Lot is going to kind of play a more focused role here. So we'll pick up in chapter 13 next week. Thank you very much.